Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled Rigid Bodies Part 6 Cache and Rendering. This is the sixth in a series of video tutorials concerning Blender's rigid body dynamics. If you have not viewed the previous tutorials, please do, as they contain information that may not be covered here. To demonstrate the rigid body dynamics cache and rendering, I've modeled in my Blender scene the elements of a simple game of jacks, sometimes called knuckle bones. This consists of 6 yellow jack objects, a red ball object, and a flat plane. Each jack is made up of a central 6-pointed core with 4 small spheres. This particular construction allows for a fairly realistic rigid body dynamic effect. The 4 small spheres are connected to the core with 4 rigid body fixed constraints. The ball and jack objects are placed above the plane. I'll play the simulation. The ball and jacks drop down along the z-axis due to gravity and bounce a bit when colliding with the bottom plane. I'll stop the simulation and go to frame number 1. Note in the Scene Editor Rigid Body Cache panel, I've set the length of the rigid body dynamic cache to 200 frames, and in the Timeline Editor, I've set the animation length to 200 frames. I'll place my 3D cursor somewhere above the ball and jacks and add a cube object to the scene. I'll scale the cube down a bit, and I'll make it an active element. Look closely at the Timeline Editor as I play the simulation. I'll stop the simulation. Notice that after I made a change to the scene and played the simulation, a green line appeared in the timeline window as the simulation was playing out. This green line indicates that Blender is building a cache of information regarding the effect of the rigid body world. This particular simulation is relatively simple, and the cache is built in real time. However, if your simulation is complex, involving a large number of collisions, the first time the simulation is played and the cache is built, it may not be able to build the cache in real time. If this is the case, the second time through the simulation should display in real time. If you stop the simulation and make a change at some point prior to the end of the cache building process, you may have to wait until the end of the cache building process to see those changes. I'll play through the simulation, and then stop and return to frame number 1. I'll select the cube object and go to the Graph Editor. Note that there is no animation curves displayed in the Graph Editor, despite the movement of the cube object. This is true of all rigid body objects in this scene. I'll go back to the 3D Editor. It is possible, but not necessary, to generate or bake keyframes for a rigid body object. Here I will select the cube object and click on the Bake to Frames button located in the Rigid Body Tools panel on the left. I'll accept the Start, End, and Step settings and click OK. Note that the baking generates a number of keyframes in the Timeline Editor for the cube object. I'll now go back to the Graph Editor, and I'll click View All. Here is now displayed the animation keyframe curves for the cube object for the 200 frame animation. I'll go back to the 3D Editor. It is not at all necessary to bake the object's keyframes prior to rendering. I'll select the cube object and delete it. I'll then play through the whole simulation. I'll then stop and go back to frame number 1. I've already added a camera, animation, lighting, and materials to the scene objects. Rendering a rigid body dynamics effect is the same as rendering any Blender animation. I'll go to the Render Editor. In the Dimensions panel, I'll accept the Blender default resolution for the outputted video, 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels at 50%. In the Output panel, I'll click on the folder icon. This displays Blender's file locator. I'll select my desktop as the output location, and I'll name this file JAX. I'll then click on the Accept button. Note that the output panel now indicates that the file will be sent to my desktop, signified by the backslashes, and the file will be named JAX. Next, I will click on the File Format button. This displays the different output formats available for rendering. I'll select MPEG as my video format. When you select MPEG, a new panel appears below the output panel titled Encoding. I'll open up this encoding panel by clicking on the arrow icon. Under Format, I'll select MPEG 4. I'll then scroll up to the top of the Rendering Properties panel and click on the Render Animation button. This will begin the rendering in the image editor frame by frame. This will take some time, so I'll pause this video until the rendering is complete. The rendering is now complete, and I have a file on my desktop named JAX0001-0200.mp4. I'll play this video from my desktop.